when language was invented, and we don't know exactly when that happened, but it did happen, because obviously there was a time before language, and which we can no longer imagine. But at some point it was invented, and when that happened, one problem was resolved and another problem was created. So the problem that was resolved was the problem of mind reading. How can we read each other's minds, and how can we know what other people are thinking and feeling? Well, once there's language, telepathy acquires a very tangible form. You can communicate through language. But the other thing that happened is that there was not just one language invented, unfortunately, but many, which means that the one thing that resolves the problem also creates a new one. You can only read the minds of the people with whom you share a language. And this obviously has become a classical problem for humankind. We think that we have resolved it by doing what I'm doing now, which is talking to you in English, although it's not my own language. Men om jag skulle prata mitt eget språk, vilket jag helst skulle vilja göra, för att det är det sätt jag bäst kan uttrycka mig på, så skulle ni inte förstå någonting. You wouldn't understand anything if I express myself in the way that I actually want to. And this was brilliantly illustrated, I think, by a friend of mine who unfortunately passed away too early, the Icelandic artist Thorvaldur Þorsteinsson. And he was, as part of his educational residency at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, and this was I think more than 20 years ago. He gave a little lecture as a performance, and he gave his little because he was not just a visual artist but also a writer and a playwright in Icelandic, and he gave a little lecture in Icelandic, a 15-minute lecture, and afterwards he says, I'm trying to say this now in Icelandic, einhverjar spurningar? And then of course the questions came, because this in Icelandic means, are there any questions? So just by staging a performance with all the elements that you expect from a linguistic performance, and then asking afterwards, are there any questions? He triggered the right response. So in a way he was trying to find a way out. He was trying to find a way around the problem of language. And I'm not going to go more deeply into noosphere than I have done in my little text. I'm just going to ask a question of all of us, whether it's not time, seeing the recent events in Europe, and I'm talking about, the criminally arrogant act by the British ruling class of imposing, Brexit on all of us, whether it's not time to reconsider our dependence on English, and whether we shouldn't try to find other ways of communicating with each other. I know that the European Union in the last 2 days have started putting out more.
For you speak how many languages?
No. It's not. But I know that the European Union in the last 2 days have started putting out more information in German and French about, more in relation to what they put out in English. And there is also now voices being raised saying that when the United Kingdom leaves, English will no longer be an official language of the European Union, because no country has notified it as their official language apart from the United Kingdom. Because Ireland and Malta, which are largely English-speaking countries, took the opportunity to notify their national languages, so they notified Gaelic and Maltese as official European languages. This, of course, they can backtrack on this now when the situation changes, because English will remain a working language probably of the European Union because of this kind of situation that we're in now. I wish that it would be easier for us to switch to French or to German than it is, because I would like to punish the British for doing this to us. That's my point.
Or to Russian.
Or to Russian, or because this is an old problem in the world. Why did we abandon Latin, for instance? It was considered a progressive act in the 17th century when Descartes started writing in French, because he thought rightly that if he writes in French, women can read what he writes because they know how to read, but they don't know how to read Latin. you know. So that was a way for him to address a female audience, very explicitly so. The last country in Europe to abandon Latin was, if I'm rightly informed, the last country to abandon Latin was the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They abandoned Latin very late, only in the early 19th century, in favor of Confucian, right? In favor of running the railways in Hungarian and the state administration in German, and then trying to empower the smaller languages throughout the empire. There is no good solution to this problem. I just wanted to point it out that mind reading is possible through language, but language also makes it impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
And if we're talking about the commons, and that's my point, if we're talking about the commons, we have to be able to talk to each other and share each other's ideas. Otherwise, we have nothing in common. So the common is not only the content we wanted to have, but it's also our possibility of actually doing things together.
Absolutely.
What about some other language, like artificial language like Esperanto?
It disappeared.
It's
huh?
very
Oh,
interesting that there is in Antwerp an Esperanto society, for instance. Yeah, but the problem with that is that in order for an artificial language to take off, it needs to transform itself into a real language, and this has happened. This is the theory about Finno-Ugrian languages. The theory of Finno-Ugrian languages is that some 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago, in the Ural area, where Europe meets Asia, theoretically speaking, people again needed to talk to each other because they needed to trade, which is one of the reasons people need to talk to each other, and they had no language in common. So they invented something that was simple enough for everybody to share, because the Finno-Ugrian languages are relatively simple in structure. But then gradually, of course, this is just one theory. Then gradually, this artificial language became a first language for many people, and then it split into the different Finno-Ugrian languages that you have today: Udmurt, Komi, Mari, Mordvin, Sami, Estonian, whatever. Hungarian is one of them. Yeah, but that's not language, huh?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
I think that there is the research done by the Italian in the 60s by Dario Fo as the principal figure of the Gram law as a practice of language that moves throughout the border, and actually recalls that function of arts that you were mentioning in this practice. It was a practice of organization of imaginations and the movement of stories throughout the north of Italy, Occitan, and was the production of, and actually what Dario Fo demonstrated in his social research is that there is a direct link between the organization of the heretics against the power of the church, against the power of Latin, in terms of the production of language as an artistic practice, as a practice of poetry, so there is a pragmatic of language that is and you know, Gram law is not about the definition of words, but is about the construction of spaces of communication. So it's about talking and losing you can see there is a lot of things in YouTube that are very interesting, is losing the production of the word, but maintaining the capacity of an oral transmission of logic. So it's exactly the other extreme than the logic linguistic of the code.
The normal in pre-modernity, you know, in pre-modern pre-imperialist, in a pre-modern pre-imperialist world, there was no universal language, right? There was nothing that could claim to be universal language. The way to communicate was precisely to take your language across the border to the next polity, you know? So in the country today that is the most linguistically diverse in the world, which is Papua New Guinea, I think you know all this. In Papua New Guinea, in the country, which is half of the island, you know, there are 500 languages. And that's the former German colony that then became a British colony and an Australian colony. And then the other half of the island, which was a Dutch colony and is now an Indonesian colony, there are another 500 languages. So the island of New Guinea represents, in a certain sense, a linguistic reality of pre-modernity. And that's why in my little text I talk about Australia, because Australia, the continent, used to be more or less like New Guinea. And there is this idea that the whole continent of Australia was managed as one estate by the various peoples who lived there, ecologically, sustainably, but how could they do that without sharing a language? One of the ways in which they communicate with each other is to always make sure, in New Guinea today, that they know, apart from their own language, at least 3 or 4 other languages spoken by the people who surround them. So there's a ripple effect, you know, of knowing at least 5 languages, and then the next person knows another 5 languages, and so on. So there is communication without universal communication. You know, there can be communication across huge territories without one language being imposed as the universal on the others. And I just think that we should revolt a little bit against English with its universalist claims. Sorry. Yes, and that's also in theory how the European Union works. In theory, everything is translated directly from Lithuanian into Maltese, which of course doesn't happen in practice, but in theory that's how it should happen.
There is also this new development on what we call machine learning, and language is solved. So no more a problem of computers. I mean, right now I can speak in Turkish in real time. You can hear it in whatever language you want. This is now possible, and it's not expensive. It is. I mean, you can find it online on the web. There are technologies doing this right now. Imagine a hearing aid, whatever, you know, we can do this right on.
And imagine the richness of this, because of course we are also because my writing is taking place mostly in English these days. And of course there are very strict unspoken rules about what you can write and how you can do it in English. And those of us who come from other languages, we know that the patterns of thought and rules of style and understanding of quality of discourse are completely different in different language systems.
Sure.
You know, like for instance, if you are if you come from a Romance language, you have a completely different idea about how to set up a text and how to communicate thought within a text than you have in English. You know, but English is imposed on us, and if this were possible, I could actually hear how you are thinking in Turkish,
for instance, yeah.
in a medium that I can understand.
It may not really translate those nuances, probably. Still, the machines,
No, but
you
in
know,
the
but
future maybe.
still, yeah, probably it's very most likely.
But I think I would go back to translation as the politics of translation is the first thing people cut out of country spending.
Yes.
And I think it has isolated countries. And so in thinking about production of knowledge, bringing back translation is important. I think it precedes opening borders.
It's sometimes misconstrued as provincial, you know, when governments in European countries demand, for instance, of cultural institutions to publish texts in the national language. Like we have to do it in our museum. We make books in English, but we can't do it without translating all the texts that are in the book into Dutch. And sometimes it's misconstrued as provincialism, but it's actually a question of democracy. You know, and it's actually a question of equal rights.
I'm sorry, I think everything is prepared.
What do you think about this Barbara Cassin's project of untranslatables, this huge book they made with a collection of philosophers, of certain philosophic terms which are untranslatable. I found that's quite problematic, because I follow a little bit of Badiou's critique of Barbara Cassin. Like, if something, whatever philosophical term, it is claiming a truth, it should be also translatable. Everything is translatable. I mean, because I would like to hear what you think of that particular project.
I don't know the projects, I can't tell you about the project, but and maybe later I can tell you my ideas about untranslatability, but I think we should have lunch.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move, because